Okay, good afternoon. We have a room of two halves, but welcome. So yes, my name's Ken Irvine. I'm from IHE Delft. We have just changed our formal title that was called UNESCO IHE from last year. And we are a very large postgraduate institute and research institute and capacity development institute, focusing mainly on the global south. So I was asked to provide the title, and it's connecting freshwater life with global sustainability. And I know this is part and development, and I know this is part of the World Water Day sessions, and of course World Water Day has now come and gone, but every day we should think of is a World Water Day. I want to start by bringing you to a little town, a developing town in northern Ethiopia called Kombolcha. And Kombolcha is one of the two towns in Ethiopia which is going under deliberate industrialization. The idea is to expand the industrial output of Ethiopia. And this is a Skinder who is a PhD student of mine working on water quality in the city. And there's a picture of Kombolcha. And there's a number of factories in Kombolcha. And the idea is to double or even triple the number of industrial units in that city. So Iskinder's work was really about trying to look at what the current water quality is within the city, and also the emissions from those processes. So there's five main industrial units: steel processing, textile, tannery, meat processing and brewery, with the usual expected problems, be it them heavy metals or organic and nutrients. And they all have, to some extent, some treatment. And I wanted to touch on some of those treatment facilities to give you a flavour at the beginning of this talk. So here is a photograph of the of those industries. This is a tannery at the top. You can see how that what that shows is the emissions from the tannery, which is very high in chromium, actually being discharged into the local woodland. This is the meat processing unit, which the retention ponds, which as you see are entirely overgrown and non-functioning. This is the textile company. We weren't allowed to photograph inside. I wasn't allowed to photograph inside, but they're very happy to show us around, and they appear to be compliant with various regulations that occur in Ethiopia. The steelworks has a problem with zinc emissions, and the brewery, which I'll come to in a minute, has organic and nutrients problems, and we weren't allowed inside that building at all. In fact, they avoided all contact with us as much as possible. And which is interesting, because of all of those five companies, the brewery is European owned by the Castile company. Castile is a family affair. On their website, there's very nice words about commitment to sustainability. This is the outflow pipe, which I hope you can see from the brewery. This is the water quality just downstream of the brewery, and these are the cabbages which are grown using that water by the local communities. And this is Mr. Castile, who is committed to environmental sustainability, perhaps in the EU, but certainly not in Ethiopia. In email exchanges with the PR people, we were told that it wasn't Castile's problem, it was because the local district council and the local industries couldn't get their act together for sustainable nutrient and industrial pollution. So this is the sort of attitude I'm afraid that Africa is still facing. It sort of reminds me of a sort of neo-colonial type view of the world. But anyway, the website of Castile is very nice. Of Castile, rather. Ethiopia has all of the necessary regulatory requirements. It has regulatory organs. It has federal and regional level for pollution control. It has regulatory implementing authorities. The problem is that there is no regulation. So all of the fine words are on paper, but there is just no capacity to actually implement it, or indeed political will to do so. And it reminded me when I was investigating this. As you know, some of you know, I'm an aquatic ecologist. I'm not an industrial chemist, but I was curious about this, so I started doing some homework, and I came across the famous Kuznets curve. And the Kuznets curve, for those who are not familiar, is this idea that when you start to industrialize, your environmental quality goes down during the process of industrialization, but after you become rich, which is the ascending curve here, actually your environmental quality improves again, because as your per capita income increases, then you get to a certain point where you can now afford to invest in pollution control. It's a very nice idea. The only problem is there's no evidence that it actually it works. And this is a nice review in ecological economics, which actually shows that, in fact, the Kuznets curve is really a bit of a myth. But it's still one which is very widely used across the African subcontinent and elsewhere in the world, I have to say, as it's okay, we can pollute now, we can clean up later. I think those who have been following the events in China for the last 20 years will see the difficulty the Chinese are now in and the amount of money they're trying to invest in environmental cleanup rather than prevention. A similar process occurs throughout sub-Saharan Africa in other aspects. I could talk for a very long time about this. I'm going to focus on wetlands and the link between wetland development, wetland production, particularly for food security, and how that affects biodiversity in the wetland swamps, and particularly the papyrus swamps of Africa. The papyrus swamps of Africa naturally cover quite a large range in the dark green there on the right-hand side, and may comprise about 10% of freshwater wetland habitats in the continent, but they are under quite continuous and monotonic degradation, estimates of 7 or so percent in the last 15 years or 50% in the last 30 years. And the reason why these wetlands are under such threat and under such pressure is because, on one hand, they are used for livelihoods for millions of people, providing a whole range of provisioning services, but usually at a fairly subsistence level. But they are also, of course, places where you have water and, to some extent, nutrients. And so they are easy, they're very obvious low-hanging fruit for food security and food development. So Rwanda, for example, has converted 75% of its valley bottom wetlands to intensive agriculture. This is usually funded by external donors, and Rwanda also has very nice policies about wetland protection. It's a signatory to the Ramsar Convention. I'll come to that in a few minutes. And you can see here, this is a conversion of what used to be a papyrus swamp into multiple agriculture, mainly rice and potatoes. At the same time, the amount of natural wetlands, this is an estimate from a paper a few years ago by Davidson, has been on a sort of pretty serious decline. I once showed this graph at another conference, and I said, well, this is the decline of wetlands, and the Ramsar Convention has not been effective. And it was pointed out to me, aha, but look here, this little, see how it's not going down anymore, it's curving up? But I think that if I look at Africa at least, the degradation and the pressure on wetlands continues despite the Ramsar Convention. And I'll come to some of the reasons for that in a few minutes. And those mainly because there is enormous pressure of external drivers to convert wetlands into areas for food security. And those wetlands, those pressures across the world are underlining and the indirect drivers of economic growth, technological innovation, population growth, etc. And then there is the direct drivers, which is in this case agricultural development. So these underlying drivers are pushing the actual conversion of the habitats within sub-Saharan Africa. I use that as an example. And the choice on the ground is not about necessarily converting a wetland to food production as a local decision. Those decisions and those choices are made for external reasons. And food security is a very good example. This is the Minion Farm swamp in Kenya, which is a very large converted wetland producing agricultural output. A lot of sugarcane, for example, is produced across former wetlands in South Africa, in Africa. And those external drivers are also things such as energy and mineral production. So a converted wetland there in South Africa at the bottom, further wetland conversions in Kenya, in the Ando wetland in Kenya, flower farm development in Uganda. Many of the flowers that you may buy in Ireland, in Cork, and at least the ones you buy in the Netherlands will come from intensive flower farm production areas in wetlands from Uganda. And wider drivers such as energy production, illustrated here by the Cahora Bassa Dam in Mozambique. The Cahora Bassa Dam in Mozambique produces electricity for South Africa. It doesn't produce electricity for Mozambique. And so those drivers are very often far removed from the actual site. And to illustrate that even further, I've circled here, as well as agricultural development, infrastructure construction, industrial development as a proximate cause, and as an underlying cause, economic growth, technological innovations, little environmental awareness. And for those who haven't read this paper, or this is the first time you have seen this reference, I encourage you to read it. It's a very thoughtful and nice treatise on this driver of wetland conversion, a global meta-analysis by Asselin et al. So external interests, which are to do with external needs and external demands, such as energy, is what drives a lot of the conversions of wetlands in Africa. There are some local conversions driven by local communities, but generally speaking, the large driver is by these external forces, these external global economic forces. And if we look at energy, for example, this map is a map of large dams and smaller dams. So large dams are in red and the smaller dams are in green. And this map of Africa's dams is going to, in another 10 years, will be vastly increased as dams continue to be advocated. The same story occurs in South America, and the same story occurs in Southeast Asia. Interesting enough, there is now pressure in the US to actually remove dams because they realize the economic value of them is not quite as high as originally thought. And of course, there's a lot of interest in producing that water security and that energy security in the global south. So when we look at some other pressures, such as catchment development and nutrient enrichment, this is a simple schematic of Lake Victoria. The red zones are highly eutrophic areas, and the blue zones are open water parts of Lake Victoria, which is one of the largest lakes in the world, and it is highly nutrient enriched. The catchment population of Lake Victoria has increased from about 3 to 30 million since the 1930s, and there's a lot of goats, there's a lot of cattle, and there's particularly increasing industrialization. And some of the major cities, such as Kampala, which are on the edge of Lake Victoria, use local wetlands as a way of treating their sewage effluent. But those wetlands not only have a limited capacity to mop up those nutrients, but also they are being converted themselves to crop production. So my advice to you, if you go to Kampala, is don't eat any of the food that's produced in the wetlands, because they're not only nutrient enriched, but there's also a lot of heavy metals. So avoid some of the local produce if it's from the wetland. So if we think about Lake Victoria, and we think about nutrient enrichment and the impacts that has, it's a very interesting, ecologically interesting, but also food security interesting example of how sustainable is food production, coupled with the challenges of industrialization and nutrient enrichment. So I want to just briefly mention nutrients, invasive species, and livelihoods in Lake Victoria. As many of you will know, Lake Victoria has introduced a few introduced species of fish. One of them, the Nile perch, provides a major industry for a major fishing industry, major industrialized fishing. Another introduced species, the Nile tilapia, seems to have been fairly benign, but nutrient enrichment fuels invasive species water hyacinth, and the nutrient enrichment of Lake Victoria has also probably, although there is some debate about this, probably was a causative agent in the switch to the dominance of Nile perch from other species of cichlid fish, owing perhaps, it's speculated, to a deoxygenation event which actually favoured the Nile perch because of the physiology of the fish itself. This little fella, the dagar, which is a small saprinid, is actually it's not industrialized as such. It's more of a local food resource. And the interaction between the Nile perch and the dagar makes for some fascinating study. The Nile perch populations exploded in the 1970s, provided the infrastructure for a very large mechanized fishery, but which, as you can see from this graph, the total numbers, the total tonnage of Nile perch, which has come from Lake Victoria, seems to be on a decline over the last 10 or so years. So the overfishing of Nile perch is very well established, despite lots of regulations, which is there to safeguard the population of the Nile perch. Those regulations effectively don't work because it is still effectively an open access fishery. So all those sorts of regulations, whether those regulations are actually implemented or not is another question, but fundamentally they can never work because it's an open access fishery. The dagar, the small cyprinid, in fact is now, for the last 15 years or so, is become the major food, the major tonnage which is caught from the lake. The dagar dominance is almost certainly related to nutrient enrichment, and which has favoured the production of a small shrimp, a caradina shrimp, which is a food source for the dagar. So there's a shift between industrial fishing, there's an interaction between introduced Nile perch, which has a decimating effect on the haplochromine native populations of cichlids, and with further nutrient enrichment, there seems to be now triggering this shift to this smaller cyprinid, which is the major food source. Most of the Nile perch, incidentally, is exported from the lake. When I was there about 3 years ago, as part of the study I've just shown the results of, I couldn't legally buy a Nile perch at the lakeshore. I could see lots of processing units. I could buy some illegal caught Nile perch and some Nile perch which were below the actual allowable catch size, which could not be traded in the local stalls around the fishing landing site I was at. But you can't buy illegally caught Nile perch at the lakeshore, but you can buy, of course, Nile perch in the supermarkets of Amsterdam. So these pressures, which I've touched on, industrialization, nutrient enrichment, and conversion of wetlands, are examples of a much wider and much more disturbing problem across the global south. If we look at the Great Lakes region, keep on this Lake Victoria at the top there, and which is slightly north and to the east of a number of Rift Valley lakes. It's not actually part of the Rift Valley per se itself, but those Rift Valley lakes, which range in age up to 12 million years old, are renowned for their very old, or up to 15 million years old, are renowned for their particularly high amount of endemicism. So the high biodiversity of endemics, extraordinary adaptation, adapted radiation of many taxa. The fish are the best known, but also there are populations of mollusks and ostracods and shrimps and crabs, which are found only in those lakes. And those lakes are also overfished, and those lakes are also undergoing increasing pressure. Those lakes also support, as well as high biodiversity, a very large number of food fish, which is used by large populations of people. In Lake Malawi, we estimate something like 200 demersal species of fish support those livelihoods, ranging from people catching fish from small canoes to slightly semi-industrialized fishing. And one of the big threats to those African Great Lakes at the moment is the exploration of oil. This paper came out 2 years ago about oil extraction imperils the African Great Lakes. Those cichlid species I mentioned are only found in Lake Malawi, for example. And if there's an oil spill from one of the proposed sites in Malawi, it will be big enough to probably actually, saturate the whole of the lake. And that's a lake with a 10,000 year residence time. So you can imagine the implication that has. So there's a trade-off then between, do we develop for oil with the risks, with the money, or do we actually put in mechanisms to protect the biodiversity of those Great Lakes? And this is the dilemma which is facing the Global South in general. And it's a dilemma which is also, I have to say, following the agricultural philosophy in Ireland, also affecting us closer to home. So there's no doubt that there are major human impacts on a whole variety of freshwater habitats and their taxa, ranging from blocking of rivers to dams, intensive agriculture, sand mining, a very unreported but very prevalent activity, eutrophication, invasive species, industrial pollution, organic pollution, to name some of the main culprits. And there is no doubt that these multiple pressures are global. This is a nice map produced a few years ago, which illustrates the risks to do with water security. So this can also be well translated into biodiversity security or biodiversity proclivity. This map accounts for the actual pressures based on population, but also the technology which is there to alleviate those pressures. And the red signifies high risk and the blue signifies low risk. So those biodiverse regions of the world are under particular relative pressure from water stress. And so we now hear increasingly about the water crisis. Make every drop count, water risks to economic progress, how do we maximize the benefits, etc., etc. And in about last month, there was an open letter produced by the high-level panel. I'm also curious when I hear about high-level panels in terms of who sits on them. Well, this is who sits on the SDG, Sustainable Development Goal number 6 high-level panel, who produced the open letter. I think 3 of these characters, if I got my numbers right, are now no longer in their positions owing to nefarious dealings. But the Dutch Prime Minister is there, and I'm assuming that he's a pretty kosher individual. So, anyway, this high-level panel talks about the need for attention to water security. It talks about the International Decade for Action, Water for Sustainable Development, which is kicked off on the 22nd of March. But in this open letter, what was very striking was that although it is focused on the Sustainable Development Goals, although it is focused on Sustainable Development Goal number 6, that of course is part of the problem, because the high-level panel for SDG 6 is not considering very well the interaction between the water goal and those other goals. And when we looked at the open letter, it talks about the SDG targets of 2030. The first targets for the SDGs are in fact 2020, and these come from the ACAI targets connected with the Convention of Biological Diversity. And those ACAI targets and those targets within the SDG documents are 2020, which don't get a mention in the open letter from the high-level panel. And therein lies one of our really big difficulties. Because as the SDGs unfold, and I'm sure Debbie can say more about this than I can, in fact, as the SDGs unfold, she can also contradict something which she may not agree with, but as the SDGs unfold, it becomes more apparent, at least to me, that the pressure to actually meet the targets within each of those SDGs is isolating the very discussion and preventing the very discussion that's needed in order to actually make the world a more sustainable place. This is cruel irony, indeed, led to or driven by conflicting demands, both of time but also of philosophy. So let's go back to our Kombolcha industrializing city in Ethiopia. The pressure for the local authorities in Kombolcha is to increase industrialization. The Ethiopian government says, we want more industrialization, do it. So their pressure is to try to expand the industry, which is not necessarily connected with protecting the natural resources or the biodiversity. And it's about choices. If we go back to the Ramsar Convention, then a good choice by the philosophy of the Ramsar Convention from the early 1970s is that wetlands such as this in Uganda will be protected. That's a good choice. That protects biodiversity, that protects wetlands, that complies with the global 169 contracting parties agreement about the Ramsar Convention. A good choice. If we look at Rwanda, which I introduced earlier, a good choice for food security is let's convert the wetlands into productive agriculture. So we have a conflict. And if we look at Sustainable Development Goal number 2, which is zero hunger, it's very easy to argue that what we need to do is to use those wetlands, even though we realize in 20 years' time the carbon will be oxidized, the nutrients will be depleted, but we can add more nutrients. If we focus on SDG 2, then and you look at the FAO guidance and the FAO rhetoric for having to increase food production by the year 2050, an increase of global food production by 2050, by 70% is necessary by 2050. Vast amounts of increased cereals and beef. Then you have to convert the wetlands. That would be the logic. And what it lacks is the integration between the targets and the goals and the philosophies. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa and you look at potential crop expansion, then there is considerable potential to increase crops. If you just look at the rain-fed area, we can increase crops. We can increase crops substantially. The difficulty is that in order to increase crops, you don't only need water, of which most of sub-Saharan Africa doesn't have enough of, but for those areas which does have enough, which that graph related to for the potential red-fed, irrigation, by the way, accounts for about 4% of the African subcontinent or the African continent. If you look at the need for increased food production, somehow you also have to bring in more nutrients. Most African farmland is deficient in both nitrogen and phosphorus. So that means you need to import nutrients into those areas. 2011, the governments of Kenya, Malawi, Tanzania, and Zambia, in fact, spent considerable portions, Tanzania almost 50%, of their budgets, on the agricultural budgets, on fertilizer subsidies. If you spend it on fertilizer subsidies, you're not spending it on something else. So these are difficult conundrums. Along the way, the different goals and integration of those goals do not come together very often, except in nice academic conferences, to talk about the value that wetlands have, for example, to a whole range of other ecosystem services, whether it be carbon sequestration, water supply, water purification, raw materials, whether it be provisioning services or the regulating services, or the horticultural services. And this quote by Falkenmark of 2004 sticks in my mind very often. There are two particular imperatives to pay attention to in view of the conflicts of water-dependent interests. One is high food security, and the other is ecological security. And this is where there is a major tension at the moment, which in terms of what's also called the biodiversity crisis, needs to be addressed, and needs to be addressed full on. If we look at trade-offs, it's all about trade-offs. And if you look at sort of a schematic of trade-offs, then basically, as you start using the landscape, as you start trading your capitals, your natural capital, your economic capital, and your social capital, as you start trading those for one another, then your total ecosystem services at a certain point of high impact tends to decline. But along the way, you can have increases of provisioning services, you can have increases or decreases of cultural services, of recreation, and generally speaking, however, as the intensification increases, you, in all situations, you end up at a point which is suboptimal. And this is the difficult trade-offs that are necessary as we try to implement the Sustainable Development Goals. There are lots of tools out there to help people. You may be familiar with the T for Water and Wetlands report. If you're not familiar with it, I thoroughly recommend that you check it out at www.tweb.org. Wetlands is very informative, and it gives us a sense of what is the true economic value. Of course, there are parts of it which are contestable, but what is the true economic value when you go beyond the provisioning service, when you go into the cultural services or the regulating services, the carbon balance, for example, the importance of methane release from wetlands, and how to mitigate that, then this is a very, very interesting piece of work which needs more prominence. And then when we think about connecting SDG 6, the water goal, with all of those other goals, there are both supporting elements and there are conflicts. And that is, and that's where, in my opinion, the discussion needs to be. Discussion doesn't need to be within each of those individual targets. It's a necessary step, but the discussion, the thinking, needs to be about the integration across. These are just what came to my mind as being a number of goals which are clearly related to ecosystem, to the SDG goal, water goal number 6. Good health, gender equality, justice, partnerships, etc. And if we look at the integration of those goals, they are inevitable, and they are necessary, and they are complicated. So this, I'm not going to try to take this knitting ball apart, but you just get the impression that there are a lot of connections, and along those lines of connectivity, there are lots of conflicts. But, and this is a little cartoon, but if we stay in our own little comfort zones, if we do not think about interdisciplinarity, and particularly if we are unable to think in a transdisciplinary way, which are the gaps, the spaces between the disciplines, if we do not think about those, we are actually not going to succeed. That is an absolute, in my opinion, a certainty. The SDGs will not succeed if we are forced, or if we choose to stay in our own particular comfort zones. Some people call them silos. I want to shift to Europe for a second. I want to shift to the Danube Basin, major river basin in Europe, and a little bit of work we did a few years ago to try to think about what's the connection between environmental policy, between economic policy, and between education policy, and try to understand that. And the take-home message was that these 3 different policies were being implemented in a disconnected way. But only by connecting them can actually the Danube Basin start thinking in a more sustainable way. A lot of investment in education, a lot of investment in economic, got a lot of investment in environment, but generally speaking, they are not being discussed within the same room. And there are some things which are obvious. If we think about an IWM, Integrated Water Resource Management world, then there needs to be a coherent strategy to try to promote that as a concept. Basin managers, whichever government agency they come from, or whether from the private sector, can also be agents of change. And filling governance gaps across those areas, and then that goes back to the SDGs, thinking about the gaps between those targets, and actually thinking about what's the governance here, is actually a key issue. So these were just some key take-home messages. So the question then, and I think this is a very important question, is that if integration and coordination is difficult in Europe, what hope for Africa? What is the challenge for a population of people which is going to become the most dominant populous area in another 50 years, and which already are suffering many of the difficulties? And that brings me to what I might call the development paradigm conundrum. And how, as a richer countries, do we support the poorer countries in terms of meeting the challenges, which are global challenges, which are not Irish challenges, which are not Dutch challenges, but they are global challenges, and only by connecting them can we succeed. I read this morning, over breakfast, an article in The Guardian which suggests that under the Paris Agreement, the developed world is lagging behind its commitment to the underdeveloped world. And I thought to myself, well, actually, no surprise, because this is a typical thing that you read about, because it's about interests and self-interest and vested interests, and not trying to break out of the very difficult traps that we've set ourselves. So, what's the way forward? And I want to, the last part of my talk will be what comes next, what can we do, what are the solutions to this, how do we connect the global with the local? And this little schematic is just a way of trying to capture what I consider to be key needs. So we have conservation action, we have policy, which sets the direction, but often there is a lack of cross-compliance. We need to understand things, we need the research, but not only for its own sake. We can research things forever, but we need to have enough information to inform decisions, and we need to be able to have enough data to actually monitor and manage what's going on. Because you can't manage, as an old adage, you can't manage what you don't measure. We can contest that, but no matter how far down the road you go in contesting that, eventually there is some sort of measurement, even if that's an intrinsic measurement. So let's accept you can't manage what you don't measure. Well, let's look at some of those measurements in the globe. This is a map of freshwater biological field stations produced a couple of years ago. And you can see immediately that there are large parts of the world where there are gaps. If we think about larger lakes, then this is an example of globally available data. This is an example of the GLION network, which is about long-term intensive data collection from large lakes. You see in Africa, despite its biological richness, there is a complete deficit. I know of one thermistor in Lake Tanganyika, by the way, which is producing data, which is run through the University of Arizona in the US, which seems to be producing nice work, but it's not in fact on the global picture in terms of data collection. So we are not measuring. We are simply not measuring. So if we don't measure, how can you actually have an argument to manage? And you can't measure, or for that matter manage, unless you have the capacity to do so. You'll be familiar perhaps with those maps of scientific output, which shows a big fat Europe and a big fat US and a very skinny Africa and South America. I'm sure you are familiar, some of you are familiar with those maps. You can Google, it's quite an interesting thing. And those maps, that deficit of information is because we don't have capacity. There is not enough training, there is not enough attention to the needs of the global south in terms of managing their own environment. Which brings me nicely to UN Environment GEMS Water, which, if I've got anything wrong here, Debbie, it's because the website I got it directly from the website. So this is this week's website information. Key activities: contributing to methodology, providing baseline support, producing interactive tutorials, capacity development education, and providing in situ workshops and advice. These are exactly the sort of things that are needed to be rolled out on a global basis if we have any potential to meet some of those global challenges. Because that knowledge capacity is so important in connecting civil society with professional development and all the little bits in between. I don't need to go through the details of this slide, but it's about connections, connecting the political thinking with the local thinking and enabling people and providing capacity in order to meet the obvious needs which are out there. But development comes in multiple guises, and sometimes it comes in multiple but well-intended, what I might call evils. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. I think a lot of aid and a lot of development work perhaps can also follow at that adage. I don't want to be too critical here, but there is very often a very top-down, paternal route of what development means. What should you do, Kenya? What should you do, Tanzania? Now, that's not taken away from any of the difficulties to do with governance and frankly, corruption in some countries where aid is very necessary. But we can also look at ourselves in Europe and the US and ask the same questions about vested interests and taking advantage of a situation. So, capacity development. On one hand, we can have high-level meetings. This is a meeting of the Ramsar Convention. This is country representatives to do with the implementation of the Ramsar Convention. This is at the other end of the scale. This is community workshops in a district level in Tanzania, and actually in the field in Uganda and Tanzania. So only by connecting those different tiers, again, in my opinion, do we have any chance of addressing some of the major goals. And I want to just, in the last few slides, think about some of the issues to do with who needs to be involved. Who needs to be involved in that discussion? And in this example, I'm thinking about the lower tier, if I can call it that, the communities. This photograph was a photograph I took when I was in Ethiopia, when I was looking at those industrial units about 4 years ago. So here we have women carrying water up a hill. I went to a local museum. The camera was tracking me, I understand. I went to a local museum and I came across this photograph and I asked myself, what's the difference? Plastic is the difference. That's the only difference between those two images, separated by 70 years perhaps. And we know the importance of women and development, and we know the importance of gender equality within a sustainable development mindset. And we know the deficits. So how do we address those? And that's really quite difficult. We are trying with funding from a number of sources and working with a number of African partners. We are embarking on a project called Women and Water for Changing Communities, which is about female participation within decision making. And it's about developing locally relevant monitoring schemes, and it's about supporting female agents of change. This is a sort of action research initiative that we are embarking on. We are trying very hard not to tell people what to do. What we are trying is to give an environment, an enabling of agency. We would like to have people to have agency so that they are in a better place to make their own decisions. If I go to any one of you and I give you 10,000 euros and I ask you to do something for me, you will probably do it. Okay, as long as it's not illegal or against your moral capacities, you will probably do it. Thanks, Ken, 10,000 euros, I'm going to go and build a chicken coop. I don't really need a chicken coop, but I'm giving you the money, I'm giving you the labor, I'm bringing everybody in. I just want you to take my money. Sure, you're going to take it. It's the same in development world. If we go and go, here's lots of money, please do something. So we're trying to do something slightly different here. And we are building on, the first thing we're building on is something we're involved with in lower Mara wetland in Tanzania, where we were part of an integrated management plan development within the lower Mara district. For those of you who know the area, you have the Mara River, the very famous Mara River with its biodiversity wildebeest migrations. At the lower end, there's a very large papyrus wetland, the Mara Swamp, and we've been working there for the last few years trying to develop capacity among local communities to do with sustainability and sustainability thinking. And what was very clear to me after visiting the site is that it's not about the wetland, it's about the area surrounding the wetland where all the pressures come from, deforestation, overgrazing, for example. And a number of other impacts, invasive species in the wetland, but also industrial mining. One of the largest gold mines in Tanzania is upstream of the Mara wetland, but also there's quite a lot of small-scale mining. This shaft you see is where slim men descend every day and hammer out rock and then bring it up to some guys there who are hand washing using mercury to process gold ore. Overgrazing and a conflict, the traditional conflict between livestock and agriculturists, which occurs across Africa. What's interesting is, for me this was really interesting, very often we have an impression that the livestock owners are different from the farmers. Very often they're not. They're just doing these multiple activities. But there are these pressures. And the other project we're drawing on is a project called Ground Truth, which is about citizen science. So we've developed ideas from those two projects to move into the women and water study. We're using three sites. One is the Mara wetland, one is the Silawana complex in Zambia, which is particularly a wildlife conservation conflict area. And we are using Mabamba Bay, a famous site for the shoebill in Lake Victoria in Uganda. So these are our study sites that we're trying to test some of these ideas of agency. What does agency mean? How can you try to understand development? So I'm a freshwater ecologist. I'm venturing into new territory. I don't know whether I'm walking a transdisciplinary road or not, but I'm certainly walking into slightly uncharted territory for me, but I'm surrounded by people who I believe are very capable and know what they're doing very much. So what we want to try to do is to have a social practice intervention to actually reflect and document the changes that we witness without actually dictating what those changes should be. We want to test a number of premises. One is that female participation improves resource management and wash decisions to do with water hygiene. This is trying to connect the different spheres of sustainability, and that female participation depends on education and the wherefore. If I ask you to go and build your chicken coop, and I don't give you anything, but I give you a plan, well, here's a plan, go and build your chicken coop, you're not going to build it, because I'm not giving you the enabling environment. So what we're trying to do is we're building on philosophy, which is quite common in Africa, of microfinance, to actually give some enabling environments. And if we don't get the money back at the end of the day, well, okay, that's a loss to the project, and that's fine. So we are trying to create an enabling environment. There are a number of challenges at all three sites. Implementation of co-design management plans. So we're trying to co-design sustainable management at a local level using our local partners. We have to be very careful that we don't go in as the people who know everything from IHE Delft, because that produces a power imbalance. It's no different than in a student class. We have to be cautious of that. We want to identify the major threats in terms of the external threats I mentioned earlier. not just the internal threats on sustainable, but the external threats, such as the conversion of wetlands. The Lower Mara, for example, has a current plan for a large irrigation scheme, which will reduce the water within the Mara wetland itself. We don't know what impact that will have on local communities. The majority of livelihoods are resource dependent, and that's split between, again, the what they use directly and what they use indirectly. And we often hear about ecotourism. Of those 3 sites, only Mamba Bay with the shoebill is probably really suitable for ecotourism as we know it. And actually it's very suited, but currently has been really not developed for that. And the other sites are probably too remote to really captivate that interest. But ecotourism, you hear everywhere about the solution. It's sometimes the solution, usually it's not. So our question really is, what about the agency? What can agency enable people to do? And can participation on demand be any meaningful source of agency? If you say, we give you agency. I was once in a meeting and someone said, I said, what do you want? They said, we want you to empower us. I cannot empower anybody. I can only encourage that they develop their own agency. So, some final thoughts for the SDG, building on all of the things I've said and the work I've been doing in the last few years. You have to have meaningful monitoring. If you don't have meaningful monitoring, if you don't know what's there, you can't do anything. You're just getting in the wind. And that information has to be trusted, not only by the scientists, but also by the communities. And I use the communities in terms of, say, political entities. And it has to involve, or should involve, citizen engagement in order to try to mobilize an interest in the whole sustainability agenda. There needs to be commitment. We need to move from metrics. We can collect these metrics forever to actually understanding what those metrics mean. Accountability and communication of those metrics. That's part of a local and a higher level political commitment. And we need to learn. We need to learn by doing, because only learning by doing helps us actually to progress a sustainability agenda. There are always surprises for anybody who's worked in areas outside their own familiarity. Once you step out of the lake from your zooplankton, where I started, there are always surprises. And those surprises are always of a social or political nature. The scientific surprises are actually much easier, in my opinion, to somehow deal with. And so I'll leave the last word, not to me, but I'll leave the last word to Dennis Norton, who in the Irish Times last week talked about the Sustainable Development Goals. He says there is ambitious vision. And so Ireland is setting out a track of ambitious vision. I hope that the ambitious vision in Ireland can be replicated by ambitious vision everywhere else in the world. And I'm very much looking forward to how Dennis and his team can actually take us one step further to meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. Okay, that was a long talk. Thank you very much.